Let's start with appearances now that we're being recorded. We'll make those and then we'll get into any housekeeping or preliminary stuff that we need to take care of.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Cole Reese. Today I'm joined by my co-counsel, Mr. Jared Nigra.
Good morning.
Morning.
And together we represent the people of the United States of America.
Defense?
Good morning, Your Honor, members of the jury. My name is Aaliyah Rapping, and I represent Kara Bassett.
Good morning, Your Honor, members of the jury. My name is Kristen Hart, and I will be second chair on behalf of Kara Bassett.
Do we have any housekeeping or preliminary stuff we need to handle? I'll let the government go first, and then defense, if there's anything you need to clean up, we'll do that.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. There's just two housekeeping matters from the government.
Okay.
First, we just wanted to make sure that the court was aware of Stipulation 7, which states that Exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted into evidence and may be used at any time for any purpose.
Is that correct, Ms. Rapping?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Am I pronouncing that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. Rapping, yes.
Perfect. All right. Any other housekeeping we need from the government?
Yes, Your Honor. We would also just ask to invoke Rule 615.
Okay. Any objection to sequestering witnesses?
No objections, Your Honor.
All right. Then they are sequestered and they'll be virtually called in when the time is right.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the government's ready to proceed with opening statements.
Any other housekeeping or matters we need to take up?
Yes, just a few more. Would you like us to ask permission before screen sharing exhibits that are pre-admitted or admitted into evidence?
You don't need to ask permission if it's part of that list of pre-admitted, but do identify what it is. So
Yes,
I know they got the exhibit stickers, but say I'm showing exhibit 7 or whatever it is.
Yes, Your Honor. And we also ask that witnesses be constructively sworn.
Certainly.
And we'd also like to note that Ms. Bassett is here with us for trial today. She just won't be visible on screen.
Understood.
And with that, the defense is ready to proceed.
Okay. Government, anything else?
No, Your Honor. We're ready for trial.
Then you may begin with your opening statement when you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Follow the defendant's words. Members of the jury, this is Dawn Clark. On August 18th of 2017, Mr. Clark disappeared from his Tallahassee home without a trace. This disappearance wasn't an accident. In fact, members of the jury, it wasn't a disappearance at all. It was murder. And today we'll prove the person responsible for his murder was the defendant, his own wife, Kara Bassett. That's why we've charged the defendant with murder. Which means that today, as the government, it's our burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant deliberately and intentionally caused the death of her husband. That's exactly what we're going to prove, and we'll prove it by following the defendant's words. From before, to during, to after the defendant killed her husband. So let's start with before. Today, you're going to hear from an FBI agent named Steph Bray, who's going to connect the defendant's words with other evidence she collected and tell you how it all leads back to the defendant having committed this crime. Agent Brandon will start with why the defendant would want to kill her husband. It may seem strange, but today you're going to hear Mr. Clark owned an elephant park the defendant wanted control of. You see, the defendant thought the elephants in that park were being treated poorly under Mr. Clark's ownership. So she made a plan. You'll hear about a legal agreement between the defendant and Mr. Clark that would give Miss Bassett control of that park if her husband could no longer run. And Agent Brandon will tell you how the defendant specifically asked for a section to be added to that agreement. a section that would give Miss Bassett control of that car if her husband mysteriously disappeared. And then he did. So we'll follow the defendant's words to the time during her husband's disappearance. Today, Agent Branham will tell you that despite the defendant claiming she had no idea where her husband was, she didn't call him. She didn't text him. Members of the jury, she didn't even reach out to the police until an entire week after her husband went missing. She didn't say a word because she knew exactly what had happened to her husband. Today, Agent Branham will show you physical evidence that will prove the defendant killed her husband with an elephant tranquilizer, then dumped his body in a swamp. And that brings us to the defendant's words after her husband's death. Today, you're going to see videos and hear interviews of the defendant from after she killed her husband. Her words will show you she wasn't upset about what had happened. She wasn't upset because she was responsible. When you follow the defendant's words from before to during to after, they will lead you straight to Dawn Clark's death. That's why we'll ask that you find her guilty. Thank you.
That's you're muted. Yep, there you go.
May it please the court. Now, Mr. Reese walked into this courtroom today with no body, no murder weapon, and only one predetermined suspect. Now, he told you that when you follow the defendant's words, you'll find that she's guilty. But members of the jury, what you will find that when you follow her words, you'll learn that she has no idea where Dawn Clark is. And you'll learn neither does the prosecution. Kara Bassett and Dawn Clark were married for 7 years. Together, they ran the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Zoo, and they shared a love for elephants, and they loved each other. But on August 18th, 2017, the worst became reality. Kara Bassett woke up to find her husband gone. A day passed, 3 days passed, 5 days passed, and a week passed, and Bassett grew worried. So she picked up the phone and called the police. And the FBI began their investigation. They asked to search her home, she complied. They asked for interviews, she complied. Anything she could do to help find Dawn, she did. But the FBI came to a conclusion. Kara did it. But members of the jury, you'll learn they reached that conclusion without ever asking the questions and getting the answers needed to get there. Now, Mr. Reese just told you that Kara Bassett murdered her husband. But was he able to tell you where the body was? No. Was he able to tell you where the murder weapon was? No. And did he ever tell you why the FBI will fail to look into other suspects? No. So when you listen to the prosecution's case today, listen to see if FBI agent Steph Branham can tell you where Dawn Clark's body is. Listen to see if FBI agent Steph Branham can tell you where the murder weapon is. Listen to see if Agent Steph Branham looked into every possible suspect. Look to see if Agent Steph Branham can tell you for certain that Dawn Clark isn't still alive. She won't be able to. Members of the jury, you'll learn that it wasn't the FBI who looked for Dawn Clark's body. Joe Young will testify today and tell you that he traveled to Costa Rica where Dawn Clark would have business, and he searched the home of Dawn Clark. And when you listen to that testimony, I want you to ask yourselves, can I be confident that Dawn Clark isn't still alive? The prosecution can't be be confident Don Clark isn't still alive, so you can't either. They jumped to conclusions before answering the questions they needed to get there. And at the end of this trial, you'll learn that they have to meet their burden beyond a reasonable doubt. And you'll learn that every single question is doubt. They will fail to meet their burden. They will fail to prove that Kara Bassett caused the death of her husband. So we'll ask that you don't let them get away with concluding before reaching answers. We'll ask that you find Kara Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Government, you can call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the government calls Agent Steph Branham to the stand.
You are pre-sworn, so you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hi, I'm Agent Steph Branham.
Agent, where do you work?
I'm a senior special agent at the FBI.
Did you ever work on an investigation involving the disappearance of a man named Don Clark?
Yes, actually, I was the lead investigator on that specific case.
What evidence did you review for that investigation?
I examined several different documents related to the defendant and her husband, Don Clark. From there, I found some physical evidence that we found after a review of the Elephant Park. The couple owned and lived at this park, and a large portion of my investigation was looking at how the defendant's statements progressed from before, during, and after she claimed her husband disappeared. I connected those statements with physical evidence, which I previously mentioned, and that led me to arrest Ms. Bassett.
Agent Branham, I want to talk about the defendant's words before her husband went missing. Are you familiar with Mr. Clark's power of attorney document?
Yes, that was a legal document drafted by his lawyer, Ms. Mandy Tuminelli, and it gave Ms. Bassett fiduciary control over Mr. Bassett's assets.
Mr. Nigro, could we please put that document on the screen? So, Agent Branham, did any part of this document interest you in your investigation?
Yes, specifically the disappearance clause.
What exactly is this disappearance clause?
Well, it's a part of this document that says Ms. Bassett would get control over all of Don's assets if he just disappeared.
Do you know who asked for this disappearance clause to be included?
Yes, it was actually included solely at the discretion of Ms. Bassett herself.
Now, ma'am, let's go to August 18th of 2017. What was that day?
It was the night that Mr. Clark went missing.
Ma'am, Ms. Rapping just said that you jumped to conclusions in this investigation before asking questions. Did you ask people questions in your investigation?
I did. I conducted many interviews of each park employee as well as a lot of Mr. Clark's friends and family.
Did you form your conclusions before you asked your questions?
No, not at all. I examined lots of evidence and investigated all the suspects before I drew any conclusions.
So let's talk about what you reviewed on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared. Did you find any evidence to explain what might have happened that night?
There was a lot of evidence that we found at the park, but what stood out to me most was the elephant tranquilizers, GPS records from Mr. Clark's van, and some forensic tests we conducted.
Let's take those one at a time. First, what did you find when you looked at those elephant tranquilizers?
I found a log for the usage of these tranquilizers, given that it was a Schedule II controlled substance. It was kept at the Elephant Park, and we found it to be some crucial evidence in this case.
Mr. Nigro, could we please put that log on the screen? So, Agent Branham, you mentioned that this was crucial evidence. What about this log made it crucial?
Well, as you see, the very last entry from August 1st, 2017 showed that there were 24 syringes remaining. However, when we investigated the park, we only found 23. From our interviews with the defendant, we know that she kept these tranquilizers before and knew exactly where they were kept. She had access to them, and when I asked her what may have happened, she claimed she had no idea and that one had never gone missing before.
Are these tranquilizers deadly?
They're extremely poisonous. Just a few drops is enough to kill any human being.
Do you know if the defendant was aware of this?
Yes, when we conducted an interview of her, she expressed that to us.
Now, you also mentioned that you reviewed some GPS data in this case. Mr. Nigro, could we please put that on the screen? So, Agent, what vehicle did this GPS data come from?
It was from the Chevrolet Express van that Mr. Clark owned and kept at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
What exactly did this data show you?
They showed us that on the night of Clark's disappearance, the van was driven from the Elephant Park at 11:17 p.m. to the Big Gum Swamp, which was 2 hours away in Florida. It was then parked at the swamp from 1:26 to 2:10 a.m. And from there, the van was driven to a local airport 132 miles, arriving at 4:29 a.m.
Now, you also mentioned that you conducted some additional forensic testing in this case. What was that forensic testing?
Well, we found the van about a week after we learned that it was staged there, and we conducted some forensic tests in there that revealed algae samples from the van and Ms. Bassett's boots at the park, and we found that it was the same algae that matched the Big Gum Swamp.
Mr. Nigro, could we please get those tests on the screen? So, Agent, what exactly are we looking at here?
Well, basically, this says that the algae on the defendant's boots and pedals of the van match the algae at the Big Gum Swamp. This indicates that Ms. Bassett was the one driving the van and that she took it to the Big Gum Swamp.
Your Honor, under Rule 702, this witness cannot testify to conclusions made because of this forensic evidence, being that she is not tendered as an expert in forensic analysis.
Yep, your response?
Yes, Your Honor, we're not using this under Rule 702 for any kind of expert conclusion. This witness stated that this indicated to us, being the FBI, that this meant the defendant was the one who drove that van. That's rationally based on the witness's perception under 701A to show that because she saw Miss Bassett had algae on her boots that matched algae at the swamp and algae on the pedals of that van, she must have been the one driving. And that's a lay witness opinion that's completely proper and admissible.
Response, Your Honor.
Certainly.
Your Honor, Agent Steph Branham has testified that the algae found in this van or on the boots were the same algae that were found at the Big Gum Swamp, meaning that the witness is testifying to conclusions made. I ask that this witness only testify to what is in this document and not the conclusions that algae connects Kara Bassett to the swamp.
Is that conclusion contained in this document, or is that a conclusion she is drawing from her review of the document?
Your Honor, in this document, it concludes that the algae could have likely originated from the Big Gum Swamp. So I ask that if the witness will testify to the likelihood or the definite conclusion, that they refer to this document rather than making her own conclusion about whether or not those algae samples were matched and that they connected to Kara Bassett.
And I do agree with that issue, which is I don't think she's qualified, or she hasn't been qualified yet, I'll say that, to give an opinion that draws on these conclusions. As long as her testimony is limited to what is contained within this evidence that's already in evidence, and keeps it to that, I have no problem with that statement. So as Ms. Rapping said, as long as she states essentially that it's likely originated from, which is what the report says, I think that's acceptable. But if she's going to give a personal opinion that it is the same, I think that's probably outside of a lay witness opinion.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
With that, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I asked that her statements that it was the same algae be stricken from the record.
They'll be struck. You can re-ask that question. The objection is sustained for the record, but certainly you're free to re-ask that within the confines of my ruling.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent Branham, what did this report say about that algae that you found in that van and on Miss Bassett's boots?
Yes, so the algae found was highly likely a match to the algae found at the Big Gum Swamp, given that it had the same specific chemicals.
Is it possible that this algae came from somewhere other than the Big Gum Swamp?
Well, I'm no expert in forensics, but based on this report, I deduced that it was extremely unlikely. The report states that you can see the algae came from the Big Gum Swamp.
Objection, Your Honor. And, under Rule 702, Agent Branham cannot testify to what she deduced from this document about the likelihood of swamp algae being found in other locations. She can testify to what this says about the uniqueness of the combinations, but she cannot testify to the likelihood of it being found in other places.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Sure. Yes.
Your Honor, this witness simply saying that she deduced was referring to the fact that this document specifically states it's unlikely this algae came from somewhere other than the Big Gum Swamp because the Redfield ratio of that algae was very specific, meaning that there were two very specific kinds of algae mixed together, and that it's unlikely that came from somewhere other than the Big Gum Swamp because those two specific kinds of algae are very unlikely to be found together in another spot. She's not testifying to her own conclusions. She's simply testifying to what's in this document using the word that that's what she deduced from reading the document.
Yeah, and I understood her to say it was coming from the document itself. So I'm going to overrule that one again within the same limitations as the prior ruling, which is as long as she is testifying to statements that are contained in this document that she reviewed or relied upon, then she can give those statements. But let's make sure we're keeping it to that's what the report determined as a result of that.
Yes, Your Honor.
One more further response, just to clarify. In the report, it states that it likely originated from the Big Gum Swamp, but does not touch on the likelihood of it being in another swamp. Therefore, I just ask that she limit her testimony to the likelihood of how likely it was to be the same as the swamp, but not the unlikelihood of it being in another swamp.
Sure, and I don't see anything in that report that says it couldn't have come from other swamps. So I think that type of answer would be improper. But certainly, I mean, what I'm looking at is it likely originated from this swamp, and it's highly likely given that unusual combination, et cetera. So I think as long as we're keeping it to that and not expanding that opinion to highly likely means it's unlikely, then that's a proper statement. So that's noted. I don't think she was getting to that yet, but I'll overrule that. Certainly feel free to object if we need to at that point.
Yes, Your Honor.
Agent Branham, just based on what this document says, where is it highly likely that this algae came from?
The Big Gum Swamp.
And is it unusual to find this algae that you found in combination with each other?
Yes, it is. I saw that in the conclusion section of this report.
Now let's go back to the defendant's words. Did the defendant say anything during this time when she claims her husband just disappeared?
Actually, what's interesting is that she didn't say anything at all. We have her cell phone records, and despite the fact that she had Don's contact information, she never reached out to him once via phone or a text message, and she didn't even call the police until a full week after he went missing.
Did you ever speak with the defendant after her husband went missing?
We conducted lots of interviews of Ms. Bassett, specifically a formal interview on September 5th of 2018.
Did anything the defendant said during these interviews stick with you throughout your investigation?
She did talk a lot about the elephant park and how she was upset with how Don ran the park as a zoo instead of an elephant sanctuary. She told me that that wasn't how she envisioned it, and that Don said it was a business and not a charity. As long as it was his money, they were going to run it his way.
Or would anything cause Mr. Clark to lose ownership of that park?
The power of attorney document. If Mr. Clark disappeared, the whole park would have been owned by the defendant, Ms. Bassett, because of the clause she asked to be included.
Agent Branham, what happened to that elephant park after Mr. Clark's disappearance?
The defendant took full control over it. Just 2 months after Don's death, she changed it from a zoo to a sanctuary, matching her vision.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions at this time.
Okay. Cross-exam?
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Branham, you searched the Big Gum Swamp in your investigation, right?
I did.
And in that search, you were with your investigative team, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you had trained dogs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those trained dogs were given Don Clark's scent.
They were.
Now, in this search, you didn't find the body of Don Clark, did you?
No, we did not.
When you searched the swamp, you didn't find shoe prints, did you?
No, we did not.
You didn't find wheelchair marks, did you?
No, but given it was a full week after Mr. Clark was reported missing, the park could have been exposed to the elements.
I'm not asking about what the park could have been exposed to. I'm simply asking, did you find wheelchair marks? You didn't, right?
Not during our investigation.
Now, you concluded that Don Clark was killed with carfentanil, right?
We did.
Well, you didn't have an autopsy report conducted on his body, did you?
We didn't find a body of Mr. Clark, so we could not conduct an autopsy report.
So that's a yes to my question. You didn't have an autopsy report conducted?
No, ma'am, we did not.
You were never able to determine a cause of death, were you?
Well, without a body, we couldn't determine a cause of death, but we did sustain it was highly likely based on carfentanil being missing. But yes, that is a yes to your question. We did not find a cause of death.
Now, in your search of the elephant zoo, you found a tranquilizer went missing, right?
Yes, ma'am, we did.
You're aware that if that carfentanil were to be used on humans, there were certain side effects, right?
Yes, there were.
And you're aware that these side effects were listed in a warning safety sheet?
Yes, I believe I reviewed that during my investigation.
So you'd recognize it if I showed it to you, right?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
At this time, my co-counsel will now screen share Exhibit 17, which is pre-admitted. Now, directing your attention to Section 3.2, some of those symptoms include convulsions.
Could you specify as to what convulsions are? I'm not specifically familiar.
You're not familiar with the symptoms of carfentanil?
Ma'am, I'm not familiar with what specifically convulsions are.
So you concluded that Don Clark was killed with carfentanil, yet you don't know some of the symptoms of carfentanil?
Ma'am, if you'll notice, it says that one of the symptoms is, in fact, death. We know that he might not have even exhibited symptoms because he would have been killed instantly through a few drops, which Ms. Bassett indicated to us.
Well, you're not an expert in carfentanil, are you?
No, ma'am, I am not, but I did rely on this report while conducting my investigation.
Now, some of those symptoms include gastrointestinal disturbance, right?
Yes, ma'am, they do.
They include nausea.
Yes, ma'am.
And also vomit.
Yes, ma'am, in addition to death.
Well, you never found any evidence of gastrointestinal disturbance.
No, ma'am, we did not.
You never found any evidence of vomit.
No, ma'am, but we deduced that Don might have been killed instantly with the carfentanil, given as just a few drops were enough to kill a human being.
So that's a yes to my question, you didn't find vomit?
No, ma'am, we never found vomit throughout our investigation.
And still to this day, you have not found the body of Don Clark, right?
We have never found the body.
And you also never found that missing syringe of carfentanil.
No, ma'am, we deduced that it was disposed of, but no, we never found it.
Now, you're a senior agent for the FBI, right?
I am. I've been working there for many years.
You've investigated over 100 cases.
I have, including lots of murder cases and violent crimes.
And you'll agree that it's important to conduct witness interviews in those investigations, right?
Yes, ma'am, of course.
It's important to interview suspects, right?
Yes, as we did in this case.
As well as eliminate potential suspects, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, let's talk about what you failed to do in today's case. You failed to interview Lisa Clark, right?
We were unable to speak with her. She refused to cooperate, actually.
All right, she refused to answer your questions.
Yes, that is correct.
But when you called her, she said a statement to you, right?
I believe so, yes, ma'am.
She said about Don Clark, that deserved to die, right?
Yes, ma'am, we did hear that.
Despite hearing that Lisa Clark thought he deserved to die, you didn't look into her further as a suspect, did you?
Well, she refused to cooperate, and yes, ma'am, she refused to cooperate.
Now, you're also aware that Kelsey Stebbins' fingerprints were found inside of Don's van, right?
She was an employee at the park, and the van was used for regular purposes, so it made sense her fingerprints were in there. But yes, her fingerprints were found.
And you're aware that Kelsey Stebbins had access to Don Clark's van?
She did.
She also had access to the elephant tranquilizers?
Yes, ma'am, she did.
Yet you never looked into her as a potential suspect, did you?
Ms. Stebbins lost her leg as part of an accident. I don't think she would have been able to move a 6'5" man.
I'm not asking about what you think she could have done. I'm asking if you looked into her as a potential suspect. Did you look into her as a potential suspect?
Yes, ma'am, we interviewed all park employees, but we found the most evidence to Ms. Bassett, which is why we investigated her.
You looked into all park employees, but you never asked about a motive for Kelsey Stebbins, did you?
We didn't find a motive for Ms. Stebbins.
Now, you also know that Don Clark, you reviewed his phone records, right?
We did,
And you recognize a copy of those if I showed it to you?
of course.
Now, you're aware that Don Clark got a text or had a call with an unlisted phone number at 6 p.m. on August 18th, right?
Yes, ma'am, that number came from San Jose, Costa Rica.
Now, you never looked into who that person was, did you?
No, ma'am, it was an unlisted number, so we were unable to investigate, but the call was from Costa Rica, which is hours away from Tallahassee.
That's a note of my question. You never looked into the person.
No, ma'am, we did not.
And you also can't tell us what they were talking about, right?
No, ma'am, there's no transcript of this phone call.
And you also never investigated Costa Rica, did you?
We did speak to the Hermosa police, but they never found anything of significance. So no, ma'am, we didn't do a thorough or a full investigation there. My apologies.
You didn't do a thorough investigation because you didn't go to Costa Rica, right?
Ma'am, we significantly spoke with the Hermosa police, but I never specifically traveled there. I was more looking into Tallahassee as there was more evidence found there.
Now, you talked about forensic evidence. You never tested mud from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, did you?
No, ma'am, the algae combination was highly likely to have originated from the Big Gum Swamp, which allowed us to know that the algae matched Miss Bassett's boots and the swamp.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, proceed.
Agent Branham, Miss Rapping just asked you about that swamp and how you didn't find any footprints there. When did the defendant report Mr. Clark is missing?
A week after his disappearance.
What could have happened at the swamp during that time?
It could have rained.
Your Honor, to the witness's testimony about what could have happened, this is not rashly based on the witness's perception, being that she wasn't there at this time where something could have happened. Therefore, it is improper opinion by a lay witness.
May I respond, Your Honor?
That one's sustained, but if you have a way of asking that to her knowledge, you're welcome to do so.
Agent Branham, to your knowledge, could it have rained in that swamp during that time?
Well, we never reviewed the weather reports, but we do live in Florida. It's pretty rainy here.
Now, let's also talk about some of the suspects Miss Rapping asked you about. Did you ever find any physical evidence pointing to Lisa Clark?
No, sir, we did not. Other than her indignation towards Clark, she appeared to have no connection to the crime.
And what about Kelsey Stebbins?
Not at all. She had absolutely no motive. And the only, I guess, physical evidence was her access to Mr. Clark's, or I guess the murder weapon here. But Miss Bassett also had access to that murder weapon and a motive.
Ma'am, who did all of your physical evidence point to as the killer?
Miss Bassett, and only Miss Bassett.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Any recross on that?
No recross, Your Honor.
Then this witness is excused. Government, do you have any other witnesses you plan to call?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the government rests.
Okay. Do we need to take up anything at mid-trial, or are we good to proceed with the defense case?
Your Honor, at this time, the defense is ready to proceed.
And you may do so.
We call Joe Young to the stand.
And you are pre-sworn, so you may proceed.
Please introduce yourself to the jury. Oh, you're muted, Mr. Young.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Young.
Mr. Young, how are you involved in today's case?
I'm a filmmaker and a documentarian. Kara Bassett, in 2015, she asked me to come film her documentary, Elephant Queen.
And in filming this documentary, what was your job?
My job was to film Kara, film the staff, film Don, the guests, the elephants, everything I could. But most of the time, it was on Kara Bassett.
And how many hours of footage do you have from filming this show?
More than any other time, about 2,000 hours.
Now, you mentioned that you would film Kara Bassett and Don Clark. In that filming, what did you observe about their relationship?
They were affectionate towards each other. It seemed to me like they had a normal relationship. They loved each other. They would dote on each other. They had their little fights, but they were married. It was a regular relationship to me.
Now, I'd like to move on to August 18th, the date of Don Clark's disappearance. Did you have any interactions with Don Clark that day?
Yeah, it was the last time I saw Don. We had a conversation around 6.
And what happened during this conversation?
We were talking normal about my upcoming trip to Mexico, my new camera capturing the Mexican hills in the sunset. And then he looked down at his phone, and his face, it just went white. He ran all the way off and just didn't say anything. I never saw him again.
Now, did you assist the FBI in their investigation into his disappearance?
I don't know if you could say that I assisted them. They asked me a couple questions, nothing major.
Did you observe their search of the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park?
I did.
And what did you observe?
Objection, Your Honor. This calls for an improper opinion. May I explain?
Certainly, go ahead.
Your Honor, this testimony is going to elicit testimony from this witness about what he observed about an FBI investigation. He's not an expert in anything at this point, and he can't testify as a lay witness to his opinion on what an FBI investigation was like. They're simply using this to show that the FBI investigation was faulty. However, he's not an expert and can't testify to that.
Any response?
May I respond?
Certainly.
Pursuant to Rule 701, this testimony is rashly based on the witness's perception. In fact, I never asked this witness to elicit any testimony about an opinion about an investigation. I simply asked the witness about what he observed in their investigation. Now, if the testimony were to go into his opinions about the validity or how well they conducted their investigation, then it would be inadmissible, but I simply asked this witness what he observed.
Any final response to that?
Yes, Your Honor, what he observed isn't relevant in that case under Rule 401 because this witness isn't an expert, and what he observed isn't relevant to the FBI's investigation or to any material fact. It doesn't make a material fact more or less probable.
Your Honor, may I respond to the 401?
Very briefly, yes.
This witness's testimony on the actions of the FBI is extremely relevant in today's case. It makes the fact more probable that the FBI had a tainted investigation. Now, while this witness will not testify to his opinions on that fact, we will leave it up to the jury to decide whether the actions he observed lead to the belief that there was a tainted investigation, being that it's extremely relevant because a fact in today's case that we're arguing is whether or not the investigation was reliable or not.
Okay. Relevance being the low bar that it is, I think what he observed is certainly permissible. Certainly, if Ms. Reese, if you feel like it goes beyond just simply, I saw X, Y, and Z, feel free to re-object to that. I'm going to overrule your objection. What did you observe, or whatever that question was, the way you phrased it is fine. So you can proceed with that.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Young, what did you observe when the FBI was searching the park?
After I got back from my trip in Mexico, I saw them touching some syringes without gloves.
Now, did you continue to film the documentary after Dawn's disappearance?
I did.
And why did you continue to film?
For one, Kara asked me to continue to film the investigation just in case anything would look spotty. And then she wanted to continue to put on a brave face so she could be an inspiration to the people watching her.
And did you continue to film after the FBI finished their investigation?
Yeah, I did.
And what did you film?
I filmed the park staff, Kara Bassett.
And would you recognize those videos if I showed them to you?
I would.
I'd like to direct your attention to your electronic notebook to exhibits 39, exhibits 39, 41, and 47.
I see those.
Do you recognize those exhibits?
I do.
And what are they?
Those are videos that I took of Kara Bassett, and there's one of Kelsey Stebbins.
And how do you recognize them?
Those are videos that I filmed.
And are these similar videos to the ones you would take before Dawn Clark disappeared?
Absolutely, same type of videos.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense moves to enter exhibits 39, 41, and 47 into evidence.
Any objection to, you said 39, 41, and 47?
Yes.
Any objection to those three exhibits?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd object hearsay to all three of those exhibits.
Okay.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yeah, let's, do you object to the entire exhibit as being hearsay, or just, are there certain things within it that you object to?
Your Honor, all three of the exhibits are entirely hearsay, as they include Miss Bassett talking about the elephant park and Dawn's business, and then also Kelsey Stebbins talking. Those are all out-of-court statements that are being offered to use to prove the truth of the matter asserted of what the witnesses are saying within those videos.
Your response?
Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to the Rule 8036, an exception to hearsay, these are records of a regularly conducted business activity. The records were made by Joe Young, a person with knowledge. The records were kept in a course of that regularly conducted activity of the business, making that documentary. Making those videos were a record of the activity, and the testimony is being made by the custodian, Joe Young. And neither the source, Joe Young, nor the method of collecting that information lacks trustworthiness, therefore is admissible under 8036.
Any response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. First of all, under Rule 8036E, the method and the witness who is testifying to these videos does indicate a lack of trustworthiness, as this witness worked with Ms. Bassett for 3 years and was paid by the defendant. Furthermore, Your Honor, there's been no foundation laid as to the other prongs, and that this witness was actually continuing to conduct this as a business activity, as opposed to a simple recreational activity of filming that documentary, because we haven't even heard about that payment that indicates the lack of trustworthiness yet.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Sure.
Opposing counsel just indicated that Joe Young was paid by Kara Bassett. We laid the foundation that he worked for Kara Bassett in making this documentary. Therefore, sufficient foundation has been laid that those other prongs have been fulfilled. There's no evidence that it lacks trustworthiness, and opposing counsel is simply testifying to the weight of this testimony of the witness to the jury. It has nothing, the trustworthiness, there's been no evidence that this witness is untrustworthy, or the method of taking these videos or conducting these interviews are untrustworthy.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Sure.
Your Honor, within 8036, it states specifically that it needs to be a record of an act, event, condition, opinion, or diagnosis. These videos are simply not any of those things. They're being used to show that this out-of-court statement they're offering is true. And they're not any of those conditions, so therefore they do not meet the exception.
Isn't this, though, I mean, video aside, whether that's a business record or not, assume it is, isn't this a hearsay within hearsay issue, that the statements on the video themselves are a separate layer of hearsay that you have to get past before in other words, the video itself could be an 8036 business record under that argument, but aren't the statements specifically, I would assume if Carol Baskin is the ones Mr. Reese objects to the most, aren't those a separate layer of hearsay that you have to have exceptions to?
No, Your Honor, those statements being in the video, the fact that my argument is that the statements in the video fall under the record of regularly conducted business activity, being that they are a part of the video.
Okay. Your argument then is that the statements themselves are the record and they're recorded by video, essentially. Is that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Sure. Just briefly, one final, and we'll move on.
Yes, Your Honor, the statements in those videos don't pertain to anything about Mr. Young's business, so therefore those statements don't meet that exception, and neither do the videos themselves.
I think it's a close call. I'm going to allow them to be in. You can cross-examine on those if you'd like to cross-examine, both as to business, but simply as to content as well. And we'll give a curative instruction as needed that these were recorded by Mr. Young from Ms. Bassett. So
Yes, sir.
The objection is noted and it's overruled. Those 39, you said 39, 41, and 47?
Yes, Your Honor.
Those will be entered into evidence over objection and you can proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Young, what did you learn from your interviews with the park employees that you mentioned?
From Kelsey Stebbins, I learned that she was never interviewed. At least that's what she told me.
My co-counsel will now screen share Exhibit 47, which was just entered into evidence. Miss Hart, the sound is not on. Could you change your computer sound to be heard from the speakers? Your Honor, since she's having technical difficulties, I can go ahead and screen share the exhibit.
That would be fine.
Okay, Your Honor, since we're having technical difficulties at this time, we'll move on.
Well, let's just presume they've been constructively played. Were you going to play them in their entirety for the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
We'll assume, Mr. Reese, I assume you know what's on those videos.
Yes, Your Honor, that's totally fine.
So let's just presume they've been played, and you can proceed questioning on direct and as well cross on those videos as if they had been played to the jury.
Yes, Your Honor. Okay. Now, let's talk about the footage you reviewed of Kara Bassett after dark. You filmed after Kara Bassett. Excuse me. Let's talk about the videos you filmed of Kara Bassett after Dawn's disappearance. What was her reaction to the disappearance?
From what I saw, she was trying to put on a brave face. But when I worked there for 2 years, I could see past that. She was devastated. She was hurting because Dawn was gone, and she was just trying to be an inspiration to the people that were watching her at home.
Now, the jury has heard testimony that there was a call from Don Clark in Costa Rica. Do you have any knowledge of Don Clark's involvement with Costa Rica?
Not too much, but what I did know was that he flew there pretty often.
Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is based on hearsay. May I explain?
Yes.
Your Honor, the only way that this witness is familiar with the fact that Mr. Clark often flew to Costa Rica was by his conversations with Mr. Clark, and those are out-of-court statements being offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, that Mr. Clark often went to Costa Rica, so that the defense can paint the picture that Mr. Clark, in this case, could have had some kind of motive to go to Costa Rica and disappear.
Your Honor, response?
Yes.
Pursuant to hearsay exception 8033, it's describing the then existing mental condition of Don Clark, being that intent or plan is admissible in those hearsay statements, therefore is admissible under exception 8033.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Brief reply, yeah.
Your Honor, those statements don't show any intent or plan or mental state. They're simply showing that he used to go to Costa Rica and went there often, which is being used for the truth of the matter asserted. It doesn't fit that exception.
And I agree with that. If he has a statement from the individual that I am going to Costa Rica, I think that falls under 8033. But if it is I learned in the past he had gone, I don't think we're going to get there on that. So I'm going to sustain that objection as to the way the question was asked. If you have an intent or planned question that he can answer, you're welcome to ask that.
Yes,
Motion to strike, Your Honor.
Yes, that's struck.
And Mr. Young, did you have any knowledge of Don Clark, or did you have any knowledge of Don Clark going to Costa Rica?
Yeah, I did come to learn in my 2 years of working there that Don often flew to Costa Rica.
And how?
Objection, Your Honor. Again, I re-raise my objection to hearsay.
Sustained. And
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Young, after reviewing the video of Kelsey Stebbins, what did you do?
After reviewing the video of Kelsey Stebbins, I went to Costa Rica to try and investigate it myself to see if Don was still alive.
And what did you do when you went to Costa Rica?
I went to Don's house where I knew that it was. I kind of broke in the window a little bit.
Lack of foundation. May I explain?
Yeah.
Your Honor, this witness and Miss Rapping have laid no foundation as to how Mr. Young would know where Mr. Clark's house was. Furthermore, to lay that foundation would, as the only way this witness would be familiar with that is from an out-of-court statement being offered for the truth of the matter asserted.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes.
Your Honor, we've laid foundation that Joe Young has worked with Kara Bassett as well as Don Clark since 2015. Therefore, if Don Clark were to travel to Costa Rica, he would have knowledge of those trips. And to the response that that foundation would call for hearsay, that hearsay would not be being used for the truth of the matter asserted, rather the effect on the listener, Joe Young, for the reasoning for the subsequent action of going to Costa Rica and visiting that home.
Overruled. He can
Yes,
answer.
Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Young, what did you find when you went to Costa Rica?
After I broke into the home, I was expecting there to be a lot of dust everywhere, but the place was spotless. There was a ceiling fan on, and Don's clothes were in the closet. It looked like someone had been living there.
Now, did you ever talk to the FBI about what you found in Costa Rica?
No, I definitely would have been willing to talk to them about my trip, but they never asked.
Thank you, Mr. Young. No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay. Cross-exam.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Good morning, Mr. Young.
Good morning.
Sir, I want to start right where you left off. You told us that you went to Costa Rica to look for Don Clark, didn't you?
I did.
And sir, you talked about some things that you found on that trip. Let's talk about what you didn't find. You didn't find any toiletries in that house, did you?
Not from what I saw, no.
There weren't any lights on when you went there.
That's right, the lights were off.
There was no food in that house.
That's true. Didn't look like there was any food in the fridge.
And Mr. Young, you stayed there for an entire week, but you didn't see anyone come or go during that time.
I wasn't constantly watching the house, but you're right. I didn't see anyone come or go.
Now, let's talk about the defendant. You first met with the defendant back in 2015, didn't you?
That's right. She saw my work on Celebrity Family Feud and thought I would be the perfect person to make her documentary on Elephant Queen.
Right, sir. She wanted you to make a documentary about her and that elephant park.
That's right, exactly.
And at that very first meeting with the defendant, she told you that one day this would be the largest elephant sanctuary in the entire nation.
That's what she said to me. That was her dream.
She told you that she wanted to make people finally care about protecting those elephants.
That's right. Kara was pushing the cause of keeping elephants safe. Really important.
And sir, as you mentioned, she titled it Elephant Queen at that first meeting, didn't she?
That's true.
And when you asked her why she titled that documentary Elephant Queen, she told you that one day that's how people would think of her.
Yeah, I do remember that conversation. That's what she said.
Sir, you'd agree with me, the defendant cared a lot about those elephants.
Yeah, she cared so much about their safety. It was hard for her to see them in cages.
Right, and you know from your conversations with the defendant that she saw that elephant park as a cause, didn't she?
That's true. She really wanted the elephants to be safe.
But you also know that her husband saw it as a business.
I would say that, yeah.
They would fight about that elephant park.
Yeah, sometimes they would.
The defendant wanted to change that elephant park into a sanctuary, but her husband wouldn't let her.
I'm not sure if I would say her husband wouldn't let her. I wouldn't say that. Don Clark was in control of the park at the time, but I wouldn't say he wouldn't let her.
Well, sir, he didn't change that park to a sanctuary, did he?
That's true. At the time, Don owned the park, but he hadn't changed it to a sanctuary.
And you know that he saw that park only as a business, not as a cause, right?
That's true.
Let's go to the summer of 2017. Around August of that summer, the defendant and her husband were having another one of their fights about that park.
I can't remember if it's July or August. Definitely the summer of 2017. But yes, I do remember that fight you're referencing.
The defendant got so angry at her husband during that fight, she threw a vase at his
Objection, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
This evidence is being used, this evidence is improper character evidence. Opposing counsel is attempting to use this event fight between Kara Bassett and Don Clark to prove action in conformity and that she acted with the same character trait of aggressiveness and violence on August 18th, 2017, therefore inadmissible under Rule 404.
May I respond?
You may.
Your Honor, we're not using this under 404A to prove any character trait of the defendant. What we're using this for is a permitted use under 404B2 to show that the defendant had a motive. And now any normal person would think it's strange for someone to kill their husband over an elephant park. We're using this instance of violence in an argument about that park to show the extent of the defendant's motive and just how far she was willing to go to protect those elephants. It's admissible.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Absolutely.
Now, while they can use the reasons for this fight as motive, using the fact that she threw a vase or acted in any type of way cannot be permitted under the motive exception under 404B2. Opposing counsel is eliciting this testimony to show that on August 18th, she acted in conformity with the character traits associated with throwing that vase, being violence and aggression. Therefore, is inadmissible under 404.
May I briefly respond, Your Honor?
Yes, briefly.
Your Honor, we're not using this for propensity. We're using it to show the extent of the motive, and that's extremely relevant and admissible under 404B2.
But I disagree that the conduct in response to the motive falls under 404B because the act is what is the motive. So the throwing of the vase is not a motive to then commit murder unless her husband threw it at her, maybe. That would fall potentially under, and then it wouldn't be a character evidence issue anyway. So I'm going to sustain that as to the violent act or the throwing of a vase and strike that from the record. But certainly any discussion of why she might have a motive is obviously fair game.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Young, around August of 2017, the defendant and her husband were fighting about changing that park into a sanctuary, weren't they?
Again, it was definitely the summer. I'm not too sure if it was August, but you're correct about the fighting about the elephant park.
And sir, the defendant and her husband, they had been fighting about that for years.
Maybe little arguments. Fighting is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but yeah.
Sir, let's talk about the defendant's words. You interviewed the defendant before and after her husband went missing, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Exhibits 36 and 37, if you could take a look at those, they're fair and accurate copies of your interviews with the defendant from June 15th of 2017, aren't they?
They are.
Your Honor, at this time, the government moves pre-marked exhibits 36 and 37 into evidence.
Any objection to those two exhibits?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, without objection, governments 36 and 37 are entered.
And Mr. Nigro, could we please play exhibit 36 for the court?
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Mr. Young, that was the defendant talking about that elephant park, wasn't it?
That's right. Classic Kara.
You know that she wanted control of that park.
Control, maybe not so much, but she did want it to be a sanctuary.
Right, sir, and she could turn it into a sanctuary if she were the one who owned it, couldn't she?
Oh, sure, of course she could.
Mr. Niger, let's play exhibit 37 for the court, please.
Nothing is more important to me than these animals. Nothing.
Mr. Young, both of those videos were taken just 2 months before Mr. Clark went missing, weren't they?
Well, that's true.
Let's talk about after. You interviewed the defendant on December 24th of 2017, didn't you?
I did.
Sir, exhibit 4 is a fair and accurate copy of that?
It looks to be it is.
We move that into evidence, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objections, Your Honor.
Without objection, Exhibit 44 will be entered into evidence.
Mr. Niagara, let's play that for the court, please.
It's Christmas Eve. Don's not here, and I miss him very much. I feel his absence every single day. And it's difficult to find the strength to go on.
Mr. Young, when that video was taken, the defendant had already changed that park into a sanctuary, just like she'd always wanted to.
That's right. She changed it in October 2017 to a sanctuary.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Young, on cross-examination, opposing counsel talked to you about some of the arguments Kara Bassett and Don Clark would have. During those arguments, did you ever witness Kara Bassett be violent with Don Clark?
No, not at all. Kara wouldn't have done something like that.
Did you ever witness any physical altercations between the two?
No, not at all. Don didn't hurt Kara. Kara didn't hurt Don. Nothing I ever saw.
Thank you. And at this time, no further questions, Your Honor.
Any recross based on that?
Yes, Your Honor. I believe I have 7 seconds, if I may proceed briefly.
Yes, you may.
Sir, you just said there were no physical altercations. The defendant threw a vase at her husband's head, didn't she?
I believe so.
That's a yes to my question.
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Okay. This witness is excused. Any other witnesses from the defense?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the defense rests its case in chief.
All right. Any other matters we need to take up before closing argument?
No, Your Honor. The defense is ready to proceed.
The government's ready as well.
Then you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Follow the defendant's words. On August 18th of 2017, Don Clark was murdered. He didn't disappear into thin air. He didn't up and leave to go to Costa Rica. He was injected with an elephant tranquilizer, taken to a swamp, and had his body dumped somewhere no one would find him. And the person who did that was the defendant. That's why we've charged her with murder, which means that today, as the government, it was our burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant deliberately and intentionally caused the death of her husband. That is exactly what we proved, and we proved it by following the defendant's words. From before, to during, to after she killed her husband. So let's start with before. Today you heard before the defendant killed her husband, she was angry with him. They had been arguing for years over turning that elephant park into a sanctuary. The defense's own witness, Joe Young, told you back in 2015, the defendant had already made up her mind. She wanted that park to become the nation's largest elephant sanctuary. She wanted to finally make people care about protecting elephants. She wanted to be the elephant queen. But her husband wouldn't budge. He told her it was a business, not a charity. And members of the jury, you saw those videos of the defendant. She told you herself. Just 2 months before her husband went missing, she was steaming. Nothing was more important to her than those elephants. And we know that at that time, the defendant already had her plan to take control of that park. On May 1st of 2017, the defendant sat down with her husband and his attorney to draft this agreement. And from that moment, the defendant saw her opportunity and used her words to take it. She asked Mr. Clark's attorney to include a disappearance clause, a new section to that agreement that would give Ms. Bassett control of that park if her husband mysteriously disappeared. And then he did. So we follow the defendant's words to the time during her husband's disappearance. Because members of the jury, he only disappeared when the defendant murdered him. You heard from Agent Branham today about that elephant tranquilizer. As the last entry on this says, just a few weeks before Mr. Clark was killed, there were 24 syringes of that elephant tranquilizer at the park. When Agent Branham went to investigate, she only found 23. And of course, the defendant tries to use her words to explain her way around this. She told Agent Branham she had no idea where that tranquilizer went. But you also heard that she never had one go missing before, that she knew exactly where they were kept, and that she knew how much tranquilizer it would take to kill a human being. Then we see those GPS records. We see that the defendant parked that van at the elephant park late at night and left it there for almost an hour. More than enough time for the defendant to get Mr. Clark's body out of that van and into that swamp. And we know that the defendant was the one driving that van because, members of the jury, you saw that algae test. Remember that the very specific kind of algae was found to be a highly likely match with the algae in the Big Gum Swamp. And it was also found on the defendant's boots and the pedals of that vehicle. Members of the jury, that's not just some coincidence. That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's during this time when the defendant claims that her husband just went missing that the words she didn't say become more important than the ones she did. When someone's husband goes missing, they call it. They tell the police, but the defendant didn't say a word. So we return to the defendant's words after she killed her husband. On my cross-examination of Mr. Young, you saw that video of the defendant just 4 months after her husband went missing. Ask yourselves, did that really seem like someone who was upset that they have no idea where their husband is? Or did it seem like someone who had gotten exactly what they wanted? And the defendant did get exactly what she wanted because just 2 months after Mr. Clark went missing, she turned that park into a sanctuary, like she'd always wanted to. Members of the jury, when you follow the defendant's words, they lead straight to her motive, straight to her plan, and straight to proof beyond a reasonable doubt that she murdered her husband. Follow her words and find her guilty. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. Members of the jury, you can't trust their conclusions because they failed to answer the questions. The government, the FBI, and Mr. Reese cannot tell you where Don Clark's body is. Now, Mr. Reese said, listen to the words of the defendant before the murder, or alleged murder, and listen to the words after. Well, you heard from the defendant herself, Kara Bassett, that she has no idea where the body is. And neither does Mr. Reese. They failed to answer the questions, so you can't trust their conclusion. Now, members of the jury, when Kara Bassett walked into this courtroom this morning, she was presumed innocent. And as she sits here in front of you right now, she is presumed innocent. And it is the job of the prosecution to prove her guilt. But they failed to meet their burden. They failed to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that Kara Bassett caused the death of Don Clark. They failed to prove that Don Clark is even dead. And they failed to meet their burden because this case is overflowing with doubt. Every question they failed to answer is doubt. And let's go ahead and walk through what they failed to tell you today. Now, Agent Steph Branham testified today, and she couldn't tell you where the body of Don Clark was. She couldn't tell you the cause of death, and she couldn't tell you where this carfentanil syringe that allegedly killed Don Clark. She even admitted to you that she didn't know the symptoms of carfentanil, yet still came to the conclusion that Don Clark was killed because of it. Members of the jury, that is doubt. Now, you also learned that Kara Bassett had a pair of shoes that the government tried to say connected her to the swamp. And they tried to use forensic evidence and the GPS records to prove that to you. But members of the jury, you heard from the FBI agent herself. She failed to look into the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Zoo for mud. Members of the jury, they failed to prove to you that the only place that mud could have originated from was the Big Gum Swamp. We have no idea where else that algae could have been. We don't know if outside of this courtroom right now, the algae found on the ground would be the same algae found on Kara Bassett's shoes. And we don't know this because the FBI failed to further investigate. That is doubt. Now, you also heard testimony that the FBI failed to look into alternate suspects. Now, they told you that Lisa Clark had no physical evidence connecting her to the crime, but members of the jury, when did the FBI ever look into Lisa Clark? She said he deserved to die, yet they ignored that and went straight to Kara Bassett. They also failed to look into Kelsey Stebbins, whose fingerprints were inside the van and who also had access to those tranquilizers. That is doubt. Now, you also heard testimony from Joe Young, who went to Costa Rica, who did what the FBI failed to do. And you learned that not only did Joe Young find evidence of life in Don Clark's home, but that Joe Young was never asked to turn over this evidence to the FBI. Agent Steph Branham testified on cross-examination, and you heard her say, "We did not complete a thorough investigation into Costa Rica." That is doubt. Members of the jury, you also learned that the FBI agent looked into the phone records of Don Clark. And when they looked into those phone records, there was a call from an unlisted number in Costa Rica, and they never confirmed who it was or what they were talking about. Now, not only did they fail to go to Costa Rica, but they failed to look into the possibility of Don being there. That is doubt. Members of the jury, Kara Bassett is a victim. She lost the love of her life, Don Clark. And instead of being given the time to grieve, she was the victim of a sloppy, incomplete, and inaccurate investigation by the FBI. The FBI jumped to conclusions without answering the questions needed to get there. They provided you with no body, no murder weapon, and no explanation for why they didn't look into the alternate suspects. They can't even tell you whether or not Don Clark is alive. That is doubt. Those are questions unanswered. And you have a duty in today's case. You have a duty to rule just in this case. You have a woman's life in your hands. What you do in today's case reflects a system of justice that applies to all of us. So be it that we are ever in the shoes of Kara Bassett, an innocent person being accused of something they did not do. You have a duty to look at the evidence in this case through a critical lens. And when you look through this evidence through that critical lens, you will find that there is only one verdict consistent with that evidence, one verdict consistent with the truth, and one verdict consistent with justice. They failed to answer the questions before reaching their conclusions. So we will ask that you find that that verdict is that Kara Bassett is not guilty. Thank you.
Any rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
The defendant failed to cover her tracks, so you can't trust her story. Members of the jury, we don't need a body for proof beyond a reasonable doubt because we have the defendant's words. The defense's own witness told you she'd already been violent with her husband when she threw that vase. There are no questions left in this case except what will you do? And the only answer supported by the evidence is finding the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Jurors, will turn our ballots in, and then once those are all submitted, we'll be able to give some comments.